And I'll go ahead and just let you know that when I get to the three dimensions here, the three dimensions have been affirmed internationally in movements too. We're not like making something up in the US church. The three dimensions apply universally, internationally, where movements are going on. But here's what happened. This team of 15 to 20 people for a year and a half was really working on this level 5 equation, and most everybody were practitioners, so they wanted the what do we need to do. We looked at the combination of where we did see level 5 multiplication in the US as well as overseas, and that team came up with 10 different characteristics of multiplying churches. And those 10 characteristics are also in the Dream Big book, the Multipliers book. Both are free downloads. But most people, including myself, can't remember 10 things easily. So like, if you made me write, I'm the author of it, I worked on it for a year and a half with that team. You know, it's been a while since I looked at the list of 10. I could right now probably tell you 6 of the 10, but it's just not, 10's a hard thing to have your head around kind of thing. So what the team concluded was, is there a way to reduce down the 10 to where the 10 characteristics really get down to 3 or 4, that there's multiple characteristics per dimension? So let me just say, the idea of 3 dimensions of multiplication, it's man-made, okay? It's not out of Genesis 16:32 or John 16:12. It's not a Bible verse that says there's 3 dimensions of multiplication. Now, I think you'll find when we get into the characteristics, they're all biblical. But it's not like there's a formula in the Bible for the 3 dimensions, the 5 dimensions, the 12 characteristics. We have to do our best to look at what the Bible gives us, but because it doesn't give us a formula, we've got to take what we do see, and then we do need to, I would advise that it's a good thing to, through the primary lens of the Bible, to then look practically around the world where multiplication's happening, both currently and historically, and say, how does what we see in the Bible contextualize to what we see around the world as we shape our own paradigm of multiplication? Does that make sense? So I think the question that I would ask you to start wrestling with, even as we get into this, wherever you are in the journey of planting, and it's not a loaded question, but it's the idea of, are you made to multiply? Like, I mean, you got to start with, you know, the command to Noah, the command to Adam, be fruitful and multiply. Like, is that a command just for those forefathers to repopulate the earth? Or is like, be fruitful and multiply, is it real? And it's not a loaded question. I'm just telling you, you got to wrestle with it for yourself. Like, what does be fruitful and multiply mean in my church? What's it mean in my life? What's it like? It's easy for us if we get married and we want to have kids to, you know, the idea of be fruitful and multiply, you know, I do see that my primary fruitfulness in my life is through my children. Like, there is a carrying on through the children part there, but independent of the children, there's a fruitfulness part that if I never had children, there's still an issue of fruitfulness. I could be the most fruitful person in the history of the world without actually having physical children. Does that make sense? And so wrestling with what be fruitful and multiply means in your own life, and then how does that play out into your church? I'm going to suggest to you that you immediately run face-to-face into the issue of scorecard or success. Like, how are you going to measure success? So let me give you, like, just right up front, let's take 2 scenarios. I'm just going to kind of take opposite ends of the spectrum. if I gave you it, and like if God gave us the thing and said, okay, here's how you're going to measure success. All right. Actually, before I go there, Larry Wackemeyer, who's part of our team, he's actually a couple of our free ebooks. Flow is one of our free ebooks. Read the book Flow, like seriously. He tells the story of his church moving from an addition-focused church to a multiplication church. And here's the question that Larry Wackemeyer had to wrestle with in his own journey. And it's a fairly simple metaphor. When you decide to play a certain sport, let's say in this case, professional basketball, you immediately know the rules. What does it mean to win? The team with the most points. What's it mean to be the all-star, the one leading? Well, you want to score a lot of points. You want to score three-pointers. You want to score points. Larry had to come to grips in this multiplication thing with this idea, where the world would see success as the person who scores the most points. And we're still in the basketball metaphor now. If you want to score the most points, the way the rules of the game are, you better be shooting the ball the most and making the highest percentage of shots. Three-pointers, free throws, you got to be scoring and getting the ball in the hoop. But here's what Larry Wackemeyer had to wrestle with. What if God's economy isn't winning by scoring and shooting, getting the ball in the hoop? What if in God's economy, you got 10 points for every assist that you made and only 2 points for every basket that you actually made? Now let that sink in. If your personal scorecard, you got 10 points for making an assist and 2 points for scoring a shot. If you wanted to win, what are you going to spend your time doing?
Assists.
You're going to be passing the ball a whole lot of times. And in fact, the reason you want to position yourself to get the ball is so you can give it to somebody else. And an assist only counts if the other person scores a goal. So your mind is going to be, I got to help this other person score a goal. I got to get myself into the right position to help somebody else score the goal. Does that make sense? Here's what I want to suggest to you as we jump into this topic. The U.S. church has defined a game called the game of fill in the blank, the attractional church, the accumulation church. There's an operating system with a set of rules. And those set of rules values that winning is growing a big church that gets on somebody's fastest growing list of most innovative large churches. There's an operating system, if I can use the metaphor, the operating system in the U.S. church values scoring points and accumulating points on the scoreboard by making baskets. I'm going to suggest to you that when you look around the world at level 5 multiplication going on, those aren't the rules of the game. I'm going to suggest to you that the operating system with the rules of the game, the way we're doing it, are perfectly aligned to give us the result that we're getting in the U.S. church, which is, for the most part, we are accumulating cruise ships of cultural Christians. We're building bigger and bigger holding tanks of cultural Christians. And I'm going to suggest to you that's because our definition of success, the rules of the game, the way we're playing them, value scoring the basket higher than making the assist. Is that fair? So now I'll give you what if God did give us a formula? What if he did give us a map? And what if he did say, when you get to heaven, well done, good and faithful servant, is going to be rooted in not what you accumulated and consumed, but by what you released and deployed. What if he really took seriously, be fruitful and multiply? the way I'm going to just leave the question with you as we jump into the content is, if we're commanded to be fruitful and multiply personally, in our families, in our communities, and in our churches, if we're commanded to do that, be fruitful and multiply, my question for you is, are you on a path right now with what you're planning? Let's just focus on church for a minute. The operating system of church, the pathway you're headed, the path you're probably on. Are you on a track? Well done, good and faithful servant, with the be fruitful and multiply. Are you entering into an operating system that's going to give you a high probability of being fruitful and multiplying? Is that fair? All right. Any questions as we're going to jump in and get moving here? Any, I do want to make sure if you guys have questions that you're coming into this wanting answered. Let's just real quickly hear if there's, any questions people would like to have answered or make sure we address as we go through this. Because I got a lot of directions I could go. Sean would tell you that 100% of the time he's asked me to do this, I've never done what he's asked me to do. So
It's true. We keep asking them back, but it's always good. So if you guys have any questions right now, let him know, but feel free to, interrupt him as he goes as well.
Todd, I know there's a few of us here who are thinking through how to create multiplication, who have been influenced by disciple-making movement type thinking and some of the disciple-making kind of missional church type expressions. Yep. And we're thinking through some of those things. Most of us, as you kind of alluded to, there's not a lot of examples to look to for like, what do we copy, particularly
Yep.
in the U.S. And even as we're in the process of pitching some of this to other churches, a lot of what we're hearing is like, well, you're never, like, this results in tiny house churches that never gets to sustainability, and
right,
shouldn't invest in that.
Yep.
So yeah, I guess I'm curious, as we kind of continue this conversation, specifically, what are the keys? Where are we seeing this actually working,
yeah.
At least in the Western church? And kind of any tips on how we're both thinking about chasing this and how we're communicating it to people who are looking at us, and as soon as they start to hear some of this language, either assume that we're just never going to hit sustainability, or kind of just what big churches are already doing.
Those are really good. I'm going to go ahead, Sean, and just address a little bit of that if it's okay, and then everybody else be thinking about their questions. Two things jump to mind. I want to be real clear getting into this. I'm on staff at New Life where Sean is. I came out of the marketplace a number of years ago. I love the local church. My calling is the local church. So if it feels like as we're going through this, man, Todd's bashing the church a lot. No, my calling is I love the local church. So the issue here isn't the church is a bad thing. So as we go through this, I'm going to challenge the paradigm. And here's what I mean by that. Just 10 years ago, when the missional kind of thing was really trying to get some traction, and honestly, it never, I'm going to tell you, I don't think it did. I own the domain missional.com, and I can't do anything with it because it's such a tainted word at this point. But I think Alan Hirsch was right 10 years ago when he said, he kind of made up the statistic, but he said, what if 60% of the U.S. population would never go to the attractional church and the operating system the way we're doing it? What if on our best day, only 40% of the U.S. population who doesn't know Jesus would actually respond to church the way we do it? That's the right kind of question to be asking, because here's the reality. People wanted to haggle over the 40% number 10 years ago. Let me ask you this. What do you think the percent is today?
Higher.
It's a higher percentage that never would, like it's no longer 40%. Okay. On our best day right now, you know what percentage of people are in church on a Sunday? Like average nationally is like 16% now. San Francisco leads the way at 3%. 3% of the population of the San Francisco Bay Area is at church on a Sunday. Guess what? 80% of people are at work Monday through Friday, but only 3% go to church. If that one's and let me not, this is not doom and gloom, it's opportunity. Europe, less than 2% of people across Europe are in church on a Sunday. San Francisco's 3%. Nationally in the US is 16 to 18%. 10 years ago, the 16 to 18% was 35%. In a decade, we've dropped that much. Guess where we're headed? We're headed toward Europe. San Francisco's just leading the way. They're at 3%. The rest of the US is headed there. So here's what I mean by Alan Hirsch was right. Like, we've got to get our head around that we can't just assume that a franchisable model of church with an operating system to try to accumulate people on a Sunday is going to get us where we need to go. The takeaway needs to be not that the church is all messed up. The takeaway needs to be, what does church in all of its different forms for the 21st century look like to reach what I think at this point, 70% of the population isn't going to go to church the way it is at this point, the kind of thing. So what does it look like to make that kind of adjustment? Now, here's what I want to suggest to you, linking it back to the missional discipleship equation. Like, if I were just doing my own like learnings at this point, and I could boil all of the stuff that we've been learning at Exponential, or I've personally been learning on leading the different things we do. If I could just change two things, like from what I'm learning, here's the two things, and this kind of goes into all the content we're going to talk about here. Somebody brought up disciple-making movements. By far the number one issue, don't even use the word missional, just disciple-making. Like, if the core purpose of the church should be disciple making, then we got a core purpose problem. Like, the actual practical implementation of church the way we're doing it, we have to be honest. The primary product we're producing the way we're doing church in the US is cultural Christians and cultural holding tanks. We're not actually making biblical disciples who make disciples in an obedience-based disciple-making kind of model. So like, at the end of the day, no amount of training or cool formulas or strategies or anything are going to take the place of disciple-making at the core. Like, what's it look like for church to have disciple-making at its core, kind of thing? And I know that sounds like just like a simple thing, but if we could just change that one thing, like that we really truly make disciple making, disciples who make disciples who make disciples, the core purpose of the church that shapes what programming we do, how we do things, the budgeting decisions, all of that stuff. That's issue number one. Here's issue number two that you're going to see is at the heart of the three dimensions we're getting ready to walk through. This is the core deal of the three dimensions. We are doing the model of church that we're doing. They say in life, follow the money. All right. Like, if you just follow the money, the decision-making trail of money in anything. Well, here's the reality. Follow the money in church. The reason we do church the way we do it, and the reason a lot of the things are happening in church the way we do it, is that we value full-time paid professional staff people. Okay? When you look around the world at where movements are happening, you don't find movements with full-time paid staff people. You find movements with bivocational microchurch things going on. And here's part of why. Follow the money. In the US context, the average church out of 340,000 churches in America is 92 people. Now follow this logic for a second. The average is 92. Most churches get stuck at 92. They never grow to more than 100. Here's why. One full-time paid professional staff person can serve about 100 people. That's why if you went across all the averages nationally right now, from Willow Creek Church to Saddleback Church to pick your church, tell me what, in the professional model, the way we're doing it, tell me what a church's average attendance is, and I'll tell you what their full-time equivalent staffing is. If a church has 3,400 people in the normal model, they have 34 full-time equivalent staff people plus or minus a few staff. And it's because it's uncanny. It's about 100 paid professionals one paid professional can handle about 100 members, church members. So here's the insanity of what happens. A new church is born. The average new church in America, in the model we're talking about now, the traditional US model, the average US church burrs with 40 to 70 people. 40 to 70 people. A part of the equation I forgot to tell you is it takes about 100 tithing a normal church of 100 takes about 100 people to support the salary and overhead of one full-time equivalent staff person. Is that making sense what I'm saying? You got to have about 100 families that are giving to the church to support each full-time staff person and the overhead that goes with that staff person. So here's what happens. The average church is born with 40 to 70 people. The average pastor who burrs the church wants to be full-time, getting a full-time salary from the church. 40 to 70 people isn't enough money to support the full-time salary and overhead of one full-time staff person. So what do we have to do? We got to subsidize outside. It's how new churches get started. Go raise 100,000, 200,000. We got to subsidize bringing in money from the outside so that we can support the full-time salary of this staff person. And if they want to launch with a couple hundred people with multiple staff, just do the math. If you want to launch a church with 250 people sustained, in the US model, you better have at least 2.5 staff people. So what I'm suggesting to you is follow the money. But here's what happens. That average church that's born with 40 to 70, there's always a tension of scarcity from the beginning because the lead pastor wants a full-time salary. There's not enough money to pay their full-time salary. The clock's ticking on outside money. You want to do marketing and outreach and programming, but the money's not there. And here's what happens. The average new church that survives does grow from 40 to about 75 people in the first 5 years, the average. But here's what happens. Once they get north of 75 and they've got one full-time staff person, the leadership team starts saying, you know, we really need a student pastor. We really need a worship pastor. We really need. And here's what happens in the average elder board. You know what? If we can just grow another 30 or 40 people, we can afford to hire that second staff person. That is why the average church in the United States plateaus and gets stuck at 92 people. 92 is at the upper end of where one full-time equivalent staff person can be the shepherd of that flock, but there's not the resource base to step out on. I mean, you could step out on faith before you have the money, but the average church is going to say, we won't hire that second person until we have the money. And you get this paradoxical, without hiring the second person, you don't grow to support the second person, so you get stuck. Does that make sense? So in this US model of church, I hate to say it, but money is the elephant in the room. Like, as long as a lead pastor wants to be full-time drawing a salary and wants to have a model that the primary model is full-time vocational pastors, you've kind of, I don't want to say it's not possible, but it does kind of cut off the multiplication potential. And you're going to see that when we jump into things here. Any other questions? Just want to make sure I get them before we get in.
I get the concern. I don't know what the alternative is. I'm very curious about if you have suggestions on what is actually a different staffing model in the church.
I actually think it's where what I meant to say in the beginning is I don't think there's a one size fits all here. I don't think the answer is throw away what we've been doing and go to something completely new. But I do think if we don't get on with some new expressions and we just rely on the old way that's not necessarily got disciple making at the core, the strength of the mega church and the mega church movement is the masses that can be attracted, and masses draw finances allow programming, and a lot of good ends up happening out of that. It's resource hubs. I'm not suggesting we get rid of that approach of resource hubs. I am suggesting that if the metaphor here were the mega church or the big attractional church is the aircraft carrier that can have this capacity with 5,000 people as a floating family with 120 airplanes to deploy. I'm suggesting in that metaphor that the problem that we've done is we're not deploying the airplanes. And an aircraft carrier with 5,000 people and 120 planes and 200 pilots, what is an aircraft carrier with 5,000 people, 120 planes, and 200 pilots that never launches an airplane? What is it? It's called a cruise ship. And I'm just telling you, the metaphor works for the U.S. church. We're building these giant cruise ships. And I'm sorry to say it this way, but use the aircraft carrier, 5,000 people on board. There's 120 airplanes. The mission of an aircraft carrier is to forward deploy power where the aircraft carrier can't go. The mission of an aircraft carrier isn't just to go float in the ocean somewhere. It's to position itself to put airplanes where the carrier can't go. To just pause on that metaphor. What if the purpose of the church in your community isn't for the church building and the church corporately to try to go everywhere, but the purpose that it's there is to deploy 100% of its members into every nook and cranny the way the airplanes fly off the carriers? Is that making sense? And here's the problem. This is where the U.S. church follows exactly the aircraft carrier. There's 5,000 people on board of an aircraft carrier. There's 200 pilots. Now let that sink in. 5,000 people, 200 pilots. So what do the 4,800 people who aren't pilots do? They support the work of the 200 pilots. They clean clothes, they cook food, they scrub floors. They do everything to operate the aircraft carrier, but they're not the ones who fly planes. Guess what the U.S. church is? A church of 5,000 people has 200 full-time paid professional staff people that fly the planes. And then the whole context becomes, we got to get the other 4,800 volunteers helping operate this thing. And what it does is it cuts off the forward deployment of the 4,800. The church was not designed to have 200 paid professionals with 4,800 helping everybody. It was designed for the genius of the end. It was designed that all 5,000 would be the family doing what the family needs to do, scrubbing decks, turning valves, cooking food, doing clothes, and simultaneously, all 5,000 would fly airplanes. This idea, the clergy-laity divide is the distinction between the paid professionals fly the planes and everybody else supports what they do. And you can say, oh, no, that's not what we want to do in church. You know, it's Ephesians 4. It's the staff are to equip the body for da-da-da. And I'm just telling you, that's a bunch of crap in the U.S. church. Like, it's a nice thing to say, but it's not how it actually works. It doesn't work that way. I don't think. And now I'm being as critical as I'm going to be. Okay. Should I jump into the 3 dimensions, Sean?
Yeah, why don't you jump into 3 dimensions? Yeah.
All right. How familiar are you guys with the 5 levels first? Because what I want to do, then I'm just going to take, I won't do long, but 2 minutes. We just updated, we did a national study with Lifeway. Have any of you guys seen the study results from Lifeway? I'll just direct you on the Exponential website on exponential.org/ebooks. You can download for free the study that we did with Lifeway on the level 5 multiplication. They did a statistically validated national study to figure out the percentage of churches at the 5 levels. And there were a lot of good learnings in there. You can download for free that report. Here's what I want to say that's consistent with, but there's a little bit of a change in the narrative the way we're doing the 5 levels. So that's why I want to go ahead and spend a minute. Here's what I want you to think about. Levels 1 and 2 and 3, we've defined level 1 as subtracting. And when I say subtracting, most of you can picture a graph. If this is time and this is number.
Hey, Todd, we can't see your screen right now. We can just see you.
Sorry about that. Can you see it now?
I can, yeah.
So all I've drawn here are 2 overlapping circles and labeled the thing on the left 1, the overlap 2, and the thing on the right 3. And this graph right here is the number of something versus time. The beautiful thing about math, and when I say subtraction, it doesn't matter how far on you're a Bible person versus a math person. In math, when you say subtraction, most people think that's going down with time. Something is going down. Then at 2, you've got plateauing. So if I said, what's plateauing look like versus time? Most people would see plateauing as a stuck or a flat level on something. And then at level 3 is addition. So on a graph, most people see addition going up. Do those 3 mathematical things make sense? Subtracting, plateauing, and adding. Here's the reality just physically. Of the 340,000 churches in America, 100% of the churches, 100% of the 340,000 churches, you could put into one of these 3 categories. So that 100% of the churches, you're either subtracting, plateauing, or adding. Now, how you define the culture of subtracting and how you define the culture of plateauing and the culture of increasing, we worked with Lifeway because they've got a lot of experience in this. So these are not just attendance numbers. It's an aggregation of everything from baptism rate, what's the transformation rate? Is it stuck? Is it growing? What's the staffing doing? What's the budget doing? What are the attendance numbers doing? So don't just think these are attendance numbers. They're an aggregation of things. And here's what the Lifeway study found in this national study. 35% of churches are at level 1 subtracting, 35% are plateauing, and 30% are adding or growing. So that adds up to 100% that you stick them in there. So that means 7 out of 10 churches are either plateauing or declining. And yet, here's the reality. Is that a good or a bad thing? Like, I'm going to suggest to you that it's not a bad thing. Like, for 2,000 years, that's been the case. If we could go back to 400 AD and do this Lifeway study, I think you'd find almost a consistent number. Like, I don't know that it would be that different. And the reason I'm saying that is think about the normal life cycle of anything. Peter Drucker, the father of modern management, he said that rarely in the history of mankind can you find an institution or organization with a sustaining impact greater than 30 to 35 years. What he really was doing was the S life cycle of something. The human body, the average person lives 82 years. And there's a season of growth and a season of plateau and a season of decline. Subtracting, adding, and plateauing are natural rhythms of life. And here's the deal. There's not a single church around today that was here 2,000 years ago. You just got to let that sink in, that God did not, in his wisdom, he did not design his church for an individual local church to be eternal. Like, it's hard to wrap your brain around that, but we don't have one local church in the entire history of local churches for 2,000 years that was here 2,000 years ago. The perpetuation of churches is a local church that has a season of plus, minus, and plateau and dies, births other ones who birth other ones. That what has brought us through 2,000 years of church is, at the end of the day, new churches getting started. Because just like the human body dies, so do churches. So given that that's how God designed it, like, what would we think these percents would be if God didn't intend that an individual local church would be eternal? If there would be a life cycle to an individual local church, it should not surprise us 35, 35, 30. I would actually suggest to you, these numbers affirm exactly what you would think it would be. And I'm also going to suggest to you that if you went and looked at businesses, the U.S. business thing does the same kind of statistic. They track churches on a 25-year life cycle, and the private sector life cycle is almost identical to what we see in churches, like in terms of that part of the dynamic of the organizational part. So here's what I want to leave you with on this one. If you think about the 3 or 4 or 5 churches that you really would like, man, if we could just be like Andy Stanley's church, or we could just be like Craig Groeschel's arguably got one of the best churches in America with 28 sites at this point and 100,000 people, and they're growing, and the Bible app and all the stuff they've got. So let's just put your head around Life Church and Craig Groeschel right now. Okay. Guess what? If Craig Groeschel's church experiences the same fate that 100% of churches in the history of Christianity have had, if you were a betting person, you would bet that Life Church won't be around in 75 years. That's hard to think about. Like, you think about the impact that Life Church is having. Here's what we know. Craig Groeschel won't be around in 75 years. And neither will any of the leaders who are part of his team in 75 years. The only question is, what will his church be doing? And I'm going to suggest to you, the only thing that you can take certainty in from a legacy standpoint isn't what they build and accumulate during that 75 years they might have favor to exist in. It's going to be what they propel and catapult forward that lives beyond their church. That makes sense? And that's where the multiplication part becomes important. So here's what happens just on you guys have seen the picture. I'm now going to add in, if this was 1, 2, and 3, minus, plus, now let's add in the idea of reproducing and multiplying at level 5. All right. If 100% of churches have a core context at 1, 2, and 3, they're subtracting, plateauing, or adding. The question is, what percentage of churches also exhibit level 4 or 5 reproducing or multiplying characteristics? And what I need you to get your head around is 100% of churches have a core at level 1, 2, or 3. And then the only question is, what percentage of churches will also have a characteristic behavior at level 4 and 5? In other words, you can be adding at level 3 and your core, like you could be an addition-oriented church, and at the same time be reproducing or multiplying. Does that make sense? So you've got Craig Groeschel's church is an adding church. They're growing and adding. but simultaneously they're planting lots of churches and they're they're reproducing and multiplying, starting campuses, planting churches. Does that make sense? That you've got to think of the 4 and 5 behavior as a separate thing from the 1, 2, and 3 core. Your church will be at 1, 2, and 3. The only question is, will it exhibit level 4 and 5 characteristics? So here's what happens in the Lifeway study. We found that at level 4, 7% of US churches, so of the 100% that are at level 1, 2, and 3 at their core, only 7% of those 340,000 churches are also exhibiting reproducing behaviors. So in other words, if we bring this to the family metaphor, not all families have kids. So in that kind of analogy here, if 100% of families are measured and we said what percentage of married couples have kids, the equivalent here would be 7%. If we were asking in marriage, what percentage of people who are married have kids? Now here's what I want you to think about. In that kind of thing, Noah's repopulate the earth, be fruitful and multiply, Adam's be fruitful and multiply. What if only 7% of married couples had kids? What would happen if only 7% had kids?
We wouldn't be here.
Civilization would end. 7% will not sustain civilization. Because of death rates and attrition and all that, okay? And so level 5, this is essentially 0%. You can find a handful of level 5 multiplying churches. This is all US numbers, by the way, not international, US. So a total of 7% of US churches are either reproducing or multiplying. Now the question is, why? And this is where we're going to get into the 3 dimensions. I'm going to just quickly, because I know you've seen it, but it's important. On the 5 levels, so you got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The number one thing you've got to understand in interpreting this chart is I want you to imagine right in the middle of level 3 is this ginormous magnet. And what do magnets do? Magnets attract, okay? And so it's not surprising that the measure of success is addition. Like if you're at level 1 or 2, if you're subtracting or plateauing, what do you just instinctively want to do? You actually want to grow. You want to add. It's not a bad thing. I mean, we want to add. In fact, at the core of all level 4 and 5 behavior, it's built on addition. So the fact that level 3, this magnet very strongly draws us to level 3. There's just this natural instinctive, we want to grow personally, families, churches. It's what it drives the operating system of life that we want to grow. We don't want to be declining. Now here's the question. In the operating system of the US church, what's the operating system do to draw, what's the magnetic force that's drawing to the level 3 magnet? And first this is where we go back to where we started with the definition of success. You just have to picture all those outreach lists every year, the largest, fastest growing, most innovative churches. That's the pinnacle of level 3 right here. That's what this magnet's trying to do, is draw us to be the largest, fastest growing, most innovative. How do we break the next growth barrier? So here's what happens. All of these arrows coming to the magnet, there is a formula for that. The US church has a franchise model. You got to have permanent buildings, the best Sunday morning show, monster outreach events, killer good marketing programs, the best worship things, the best children's ministry. All of this operating system right here, the magnet, the word that goes here is programmatic, right? programs drive the operating system. Now, here's the question I have for you. If we jump to the other end of the spectrum, which is relationship, a disciple who makes a disciple who makes a disciple, a disciple who makes a disciple makes a disciple is naturally, inherently reproducing and multiplying. In fact, the fruit of a relational discipleship, kind of the way Jesus does it, the fruit of that is reproduction and multiplication. Let me ask you this. How many programs in the history of Christianity naturally, inherently, organically reproduce and multiply? The answer is exactly 0. The problem with a programmatic approach is it takes energy, resource, time, effort, and then it doesn't reproduce itself. All of that energy is to grow it. I'm going to use the words to feed the beast. On the left side of this magnet leading up to level 3, we put all this programmatic energy into building the infrastructure and building the ability to grow and add. And our energy is not instinctively going into something that will naturally reproduce. It's going into something that will consume and consume and consume and consume and never satisfy. Does that make sense? So here's the thing, and I promise we're moving on. So every magnet attracts both ways. On the other side of this magnet is a magnetic field pulling back the other way. And here's what I need to share with you. 8 or 9 years ago, before we even had this level 5 thing, it's partly what prompted it. We convened 11 megachurch pastors and Alan Hirsch. This was like 9 years ago now, 10 years ago. And all it was for was a retreat. We kept hearing prominent megachurch pastors, and in our case, these were all megachurch pastors who were also leading national church planting networks. So the profile of these megachurch guys were they're leading national church planting networks and megachurches. And the reason we pulled them together had nothing to do with church planting. When we were traveling around, we kept hearing megachurch pastors say, the bigger my church gets, the more lonely I get. And so we pulled a retreat together about 9 years ago to help just to get these megachurch pastors together with no agenda other than relational fellowship together. And so no agenda. We went around the room the first time with the 11 megachurch guys. Alan Hirsch was sitting 12th position. And it's kind of comical that Alan Hirsch was actually there. And he was just a friend at the time and we had him come to sit in. But we went around the room the first time and said, across all the domains of your life, your family, your church, your community, what's your biggest burden? And the first guy said, oh, it's easy. I launched my church 20 years ago. By God's grace, we're a mega church. We're doing multi-site. We're doing church planting. We're doing externally focused. And here's what he said, almost verbatim. He said, but there's not enough years left in my life to just keep growing this thing bigger. I'm interested in how to change the conversation from where's the next one to how do we release 150 of our people to take our city. And I get goosebumps telling the story every time because we went to the second megachurch pastor and he said, oh my goodness, that's mine. Now recognize they were given permission that they could talk about their wife, their kids, their staff, their budget problems. It's like anything across all the domains of your life. What's your biggest burden? 11 out of 11 megachurch pastors said, that's mine, that's mine, that's mine, that's mine. Okay. Now let me suggest to you that the left side of the magnet over here, okay, over here on the left, what they're all saying right now is, man, I'm in this operating system that consumes and consumes and consumes, and we're growing and we're growing and we're growing. And I'm not sure I'm building this ladder against the right wall. Like, I'm wondering if there's something more beyond not just on wondering, they're knowing there's something naturally beyond. Here's what they all were doing. They were all having midlife crises. People in the marketplace who spent 20 years like I did going up the corporate ladder, and all of a sudden they wake up in their 40s and 50s and they're like, man, is this what I'm going to do with the rest of my life? Am I on the right track? You had 11 out of 11 megachurch pastors that are experiencing some form of been there, done that. Am I just going to stay caught up in this operating system over here? So here's what we did. We went around the room a second time and asked the question, man, if 11 out of 11 of you want to break free of this, you all have money. You got big platforms. You got a microphone. You got staff. You got it all. Like, why aren't you doing the thing that you're discontented about? And here's what happened. The first guy said, oh, it's easy for me. We've got an $11.2 million building debt. I gotta fuel that building debt. Like, I can't just start releasing people because the people I'll release are the ones paying my building debt. We went to the second person. The second person said, oh, it's easy. And I remember the number. We've got 927 children's workers it takes every week to run our children's ministry. Now let that sink in. It takes 927 children's workers a week to run their children's ministry. That sounds like the 4,800 people on an aircraft carrier. Okay? We got to have 927 people. Then here's what the person said. How in the world could I get my full-time paid children's staff to want to convince their workers that they ought to be released into the community to do stuff beyond the walls of the church when they can't recruit 927 people a week to fill the needs we have? It said, basically what they were saying is, yeah, we'd love to release more people into the nooks and crannies of society, but we're having a hard time feeding the beast inside. This left side over here, we got to consume our resources to feed the left side. Third person, oh my goodness, every time we release one of our, somebody to plant a church, it's our best staff people that want to leave and we have a momentum hit and da-da-da. Well, here's what they were all saying. The left side's fueling it, but every one of the factors that got them to level 3 and sustains them at level 3 is the factor that's holding them back. Just think about it. The building debt, the $11.2 million building debt. When you're on the left side over here and you're at level 1 or 2 and you want to spark growth to level 3, how cool is it to get an $11.2 million building? In fact, all the studies will show you see a big jump in attendance when you get your own building. So it is an accelerator over here, but then it's also something that holds you back from level 4 and 5 behavior. Is that making sense? All right. So any questions before I jump into the 3 dimensions? Am I boring you guys? I can't tell if you're all awake or not.
You're good, Todd. Let's jump into the level of 3 dimensions.
All right. Just so I take a break for a second, where are you guys at? Where are you all located?
Yeah, guys, we'll do the regular West Coast, East Coast, North to South.
Hey, Todd, I'm Jaron. I'm in Vancouver, Canada, and we're moving towards making disciples and hoping to reach those 4 and 5 levels.
And I'm Chris, currently in Portland, Maine, but planting in Denver, Colorado, and I'm thoroughly enjoying this so far. This is good. This is what I've been wondering about.
Good. So you're with Scott Tobby.
I am, yeah.
Good. Scott's a great guy.
He is, yeah.
Where else?
Hey, Todd. Josh Wilson here. I am in Boston, finishing up a residency with Chris Hall at Reunion and planting a church called The Table.
Great.
My name's Ben Abbott. I'm down south of Orlando in Florida, planting a church called Multiply Christian Church. So I'm listening very carefully because I want to get from addition to multiplication. I don't want to do addition anymore.
All righty. We got everybody, right, Sean?
Yep.
All right. Here's what I'm going to do. I told you that we had come up with 10 factors we were able to boil those 10 down to 3. But here's what the picture I've got to have you get in your mind for a minute. Does anybody know what a tension diagram is? Like in engineering terms, here's what a tension diagram is. In ministry, who doesn't want to spend more time with their kids and family? Like, you've got this tension that ministry is a lifestyle 24/7. You got to work a lot of evenings, you work on Sunday. So one tension is that the job demands 24/7 lifestyle. But the tension the other way is that our primary stewardship is of our wife and kids. So like there's a tension that we've got to balance between those two things in ministry. For many of us, I came out of the marketplace, 20 years later with adjusted for inflation. I don't make as much money now as I did 20 years ago. So like there's this money tension in ministry, okay? Many of us in ministry could make a whole lot more money and have it a whole lot easier if we weren't in ministry. So there's this frugal lifestyle tension in ministry, that there's the reality of what ministry pays versus the demands. And for most of us in full-time ministry, it's not like we can afford to take on side gigs to make additional money. So is that making sense? Like there's these tensions that have to be managed, okay? So when we talk about 3 dimensions, I want you to picture a three dimensions of a tension diagram. And the way we're going to do this is imagine that there's enough of us on this call that let's imagine we were going to have 6 teams that are doing 3 simultaneous tug of wars. So these lines are ropes. Okay. Here's rope 1, rope 2, rope 3. And we've got 6 teams around the outside. So this team right here is trying to pull, and now let's assume that each of this is not a really good rendering, but pretend there's a red flag on that line, and there's a red flag on that line, and there's a red flag on that line. So you got the picture, 6 teams, 3 ropes, you're playing tug of war. Everybody got that picture in your mind? And team 1 is trying to pull the flag toward their team. Team 2 is trying to pull the flag to win in their direction. So you've got 3 simultaneous games of tug of war going on, right? But to win this game of tug of war, let's pretend the only way you could win is not by pulling things off one end, but it's by getting all 3 flags centered over the middle for a bullseye. So winning isn't yanking it off one end of the spectrum. Winning is finding a balance that all the ropes are staying the same. Am I making this too complicated, or you got the picture in your mind with the teams playing tug of war? And the goal of the game here is to keep the flags in the middle, not to actually pull them one way. Okay. Now, what would happen if, imagine what happens right now if this team, oops, I got to get a bright color here. Imagine if this team lets go of their rope, and this team lets go of their rope, and this team lets go of their rope. So 3 of the 6 teams let go of their rope. What would happen?
It just gets pulled.
The other 3 teams over here, the red flag is going to get pulled all the way over here, all the way over here, and all the way over here, right? That makes sense? And the net effect is that if you could kind of take the center of that, instead of the center being right here, the center of gravity, your center is, if you just took these 3, the center moves this way. Does that make sense of where the flags are? So here's what I want to suggest to you just as a starting point for this. The big picture, 3 simultaneous tug of wars. In what we're talking about, all 3 dimensions have a multiplication dimension. There's one multiplication team on each end, and there's an addition team. Got the picture now? So each of the 3 dimensions has an addition end and a multiplication end. Those 2 are always tugging against one another. Does that make sense? But you don't want just one of them to win out. So for example, all healthy multiplication is built on healthy addition. When Jesus said, go and make disciples, it wasn't go and win them 1,000,000 at a time. The model he gave us was 1 at a time. All through the New Testament, all through Acts, the body of believers were faithful in what they were doing, and God added to their numbers daily. When God gave Noah and Adam the method for repopulating the earth, thousands at a time or 1 at a time? Be fruitful. It's really fun to think about. Be fruitful and multiply. And the method of multiplying is sustained addition. Sustained healthy addition, Jesus way. Does that make sense? So now if we're back to this idea of tug of war, it isn't that we want addition or multiplication to win one way or the other. We've got to find the happy balance that it's addition and multiplication, and it's multiplication built on addition. All right? But here's what's happened. All 3 dimensions I'm getting ready to walk you guys through, all 3 dimensions. We have cut off the multiplication dimensions. That results in addition pulling both ways, or all 3 ways. And what we've done is we completely have a level 3. We've let that level 3 magnet on the left side win. And the bullseye for level 4 and 5 multiplication doesn't exist, and it moves over. So what I'm getting ready to show you guys in the 3 dimensions, we're now going to unpack these one by one so I can show you how we've lost the multiplication part of it and it's given way to the addition part. Any questions before we move on? We're not as behind as you think, Sean, because I actually covered some of what we're going to cover already.
Good.
Are you worried, Sean?
A little bit. A little bit.
All right, dimension number 1. So here's multiply, here's add. Anybody already know what dimension number 1 is? It's more important, it's far more important than the other 2. This is like the number 1 important issue.
You guys know what it is?
Mm-hmm.
This is disciple making. All right, let's start in each of the 3 dimensions. We're going to start with Jesus way. So if we were putting addition and multiplication Jesus way together, what is the addition part of Jesus method? How would you characterize the addition part for Jesus method of disciple making? You guys are about to fail this class.
Come follow me.
Come follow me. Is it programmatic?
Highly relational.
Highly relational. So let's put the word relational over here. Is it thousands at a time or 1 at a time?
One
One
at a time.
So it's relational 1 at a time. And it is important to grab onto. Jesus could have spent 3 years filling up coliseums of people and doing the Billy Graham revival thing. It's not the method he gave. He modeled for 3 years a 1 at a time. Even when we see the big group things like the feeding of the 5,000, it was for the purpose of teaching the disciples in the one-on-one relationship stuff he was doing with them. So here's the question, then what's the method of multiplication in Jesus' model? If the addition is one at a time relationally, what's the multiplication?
Go
Each
into
one of those
likewise.
ones.
Say again?
I was going to say each one of those individuals shares it with somebody else.
Again, this is why this isn't like profound. We've just perverted the method. Like you make one at a time, and the one at a time, this is like a back and forth oscillation. The one multiplies by doing another one, and the way we end up adding is when the previous generation reproduces themselves into somebody else. It's a disciple who makes a disciple who makes a disciple who makes a disciple who makes a disciple. That's as simple as it gets in Jesus' method of, and look how cool the integration of the addition and the multiplication is. The fruit of healthy disciple making is multiplication. You don't even have to have a if you are doing disciple making Jesus' way, the fruit is multiplication, right? So here's the question. This is all Jesus' way. Now in red, let's pit that against it. So I'm sorry. In disciple making Jesus' way, it's a disciple who makes a disciple. So now let me ask you, in the level 3 operating system of the U.S. church, the way we're doing that we're doing disciple making in the U.S. church now. Here's the question: how are we doing addition? What's the if relational is the word Jesus would do one at a time? Let me start with the easy part. Are we doing it one at a time?
Yeah.
See, I would argue kinda. Like, at the end of the day, the average church in America isn't having hundreds of people show up new every week. Like, for all the efforts we're doing, it's still, we're not seeing the New Testament and God added to their numbers daily kind of thing. Like, but
Yeah, so many people are going and taking people back to the church to be added. Is that what you're saying?
yeah, I'm saying I think we're closer to one at a time than we are to lots at a time kind of thing. I don't think we see lots of stories of, wow, hundreds of people being baptized every Sunday kind of thing. It's a trickle. If you just took the average church in America that's even at level 3 growing, and you looked at their growth rate of new people coming in, you wouldn't see it jumping in hundreds at a time. You'd see it trickling in more on an addition kind of thing. And I'm not saying it's the same kind of addition as Jesus. I'm just saying it's probably more close to one at a time than it is thousands at a time. The bigger question is what word do you use instead of relational on what we're doing in the U.S. church? That's the bigger question. If I made you pick one word that defines how we're adding, how are we adding?
I'm going to say corporate.
Corporately, what else?
Programmatic.
This is where I want to bring, I'm just going to cross out now the word relational. What we're doing in the U.S. church is our method of adding is programmatic, not relationally through disciple making. It's programmatic. Now, we can argue that, well, the reason we're doing outreach events and the reason we're putting 80% of our effort into Sunday morning is to equip members to invite their friends to something one at a time. And that's fair. But here's why, what happens, I said it earlier, how many programs in the history of the church have ever, what's the form of multiplication for programs? The only thing you can put over here is more effort and resource. As soon as you want to scale what you're doing, and this is multiplying is just scaling. As soon as you want to scale what you're doing, we don't have a model programmatically that scales. Programs don't scale. Programs consume resources. Is that making sense? So what we've done is we've essentially cut off the multiply part, because more effort and resources really over here on the program side. And what I'm wanting to show you right now is, if you come back to this picture, we just took this first dimension right here, disciple making, and we're showing that because we're not doing it Jesus way in the U.S. church, we're cutting off the multiplication end, and it's pushing us toward the addition end. And in this case, it's programmatic versus relational. Okay? Now, I'm going to move on to the second dimension. So, any guesses on a second dimension? Let's say we're killing it on disciple making. We're actually doing it Jesus way. Like, we are making disciples Jesus way. Let's say that the house church, I want to bring it back to what you asked earlier about the house church movement and missional. Let's say we're killing it in the house church. Like, we are making disciples Jesus way. One at a time, they're reproducing themselves. What's next? Like, what that by itself doesn't immediately equate to multiply. What else do we need to be doing? Just think it out. You're running this killer good house church. That's the motto you're using. And man, you're nailing it. Like, you're making disciples, and those disciples are making disciples. Like, what's your biggest burden now? Like, what are you burdened by?
Reproducing leaders.
Why? You got a house church. Why do you need more leaders in a house church?
Because if you're going to multiply,
I'm not saying you don't. I'm just asking. I'm challenging the why do you need more leaders? What's it leading to?
Multiplying the actual house churches or micro churches.
Okay. So there's a multiply the house church. Let me ask you this. Why are you focused on the multiply part before the grow part? I'm not saying you should or shouldn't be. I'm just asking the question. Like, the average person, they would be thinking, oh crap, there's no more room in our house. We got to have more room. We need to now have a facility. We need to kind of thing. So yeah. You're already drawing and I'm not disagreeing with you, by the way, but there's already a value proposition that's there when your mind goes to multiplying your house church. That's not necessarily where the average person is. Okay. But let's stick with the healthy path for a minute. You're nailing it on making disciples who are making disciples. Play the clock out 10 years into the future. What does success look like 10 years later? You've got this house church that's killing it. They're writing you up in magazines because you're making disciples the way Jesus modeled it, kind of thing. What are you doing over the 10 years then? What's it look like in that 10 years while you're killing it making disciples?
Well, if it's a multiplication movement, then hopefully in 10 years, you've covered everybody in your area, if not your state or in your country or continent.
Here's what I'm going to do for sake of time, because you're on the right path. I'm going to go ahead and fill in. I'm going to suggest to you we're not yet to the word multiply. We're now at the word mobilization. And here's what I mean by mobilization. Ephesians 1, I think, gives a great definition for the church. In Ephesians 1, 21 and 22, the church is to be the fullness of Jesus into every crack and cranny of society. The whole book of Ephesians is the fullness of Jesus sort of thing. So we've got to make a decision, and it's a critical, this is like the critical decision when you're nailing the disciple making thing. And I'm going to suggest to you, it's where the missional part in the house church movement went off track. Because the question you wrestle with when you start nailing it on disciple making is what are we doing with the fruit of the disciples that we're producing? Part of what happened in the house church movement is part of why people were in the house church is they were fed up with the institutional church and they really wanted their own cliquish small group. The house church movement in a lot of cases did not want to mobilize. This idea of get into every crack and cranny of society, this is subtle, but it's the missional part of the house church movement. You had the house church movement part going on with Barna leading the way years ago. And the missional guys started to bring the mobilization impulse to that conversation. But here's the question. You got a house church going, filling up your living room right now. What does mobilization look like? And let's be really practical now. Here's the multiply end. Here's the addition end. Let's go back to the first century church. I'm going to suggest to you that what we see in the book of Acts, again, we're on the what's the healthy part look like? This is where the aircraft metaphor fits in, aircraft carrier. We need 5,000 people who are being the family, doing what the family needs to do, and 5,000 people flying planes. We need people who are adding and who are multiplying. And here's what I want to suggest on the mobilization scale. I would call this end living in common. It's the Acts 2 church. The prevalent model of evangelism in the New Testament is a really simple thing. It's insiders in the church behaving in a way that outsiders are intrigued and want to be part of what insiders have. That's called living in common. When people are giving away and selling their property and taking care of one another, let me say it this way. I'm going to go ahead and put an X here and say, we're not on average demonstrating healthy family to people in church. Our word over here is volunteerism. The word ought to be family. Think of what a healthy family is. It's 24/7. The family is at the center of the picture, not a strategy off to the side. Think about what happens in church. Oftentimes, because we're in such competition for people's time, there's only 168 hours in a week and people work for 60 hours a week and then their kids are in 30 hours of things. What we're really wanting, if we could just get 3 hours a week, 1 hour in worship, 1 hour serving, and 1 hour in small group. I hate to tell you, but that's the standard in the average level 3 operating system of the church. Because we've already kind of lost the battle of people's time, rather than trying to create a healthy family that sees their role in the family of God and in the church as their core relationship thing, we've made it programmatic. If we can just get 3 hours of their time a week, if we can get them to show up on Sunday, we can get them serving in one of the services, and we can get them into small group. And from a mobilization standpoint, that's the issue of we're really focused on volunteerism. Here's the deal in the church. If you added up all the volunteer hours mobilized in the United States in nonprofits in a year, the church, you would have to take numbers 2 through 10 on the list. And if you added up collectively all the volunteer hours of organizations 2 through 10, the church is number 1. The volunteer hours of 2 through 10 don't add up to the collective volunteer hours that the church mobilizes every week. Are you following me? The 340,000 churches in America, add up the volunteer hours that those churches are mobilizing, but you still have to come back now, link it back to disciple making. For what purpose are we by far the largest volunteer mobilization organization on the planet? Okay, let me suggest to you, if you come back to this picture, the programmatic part over here, but come back over here, programmatic versus relational. Here's what we've done. If living in common ought to be the addition part, we've put volunteerism in its place. And why is volunteerism in its place? Because volunteerism fuels our insatiable need for fueling programs. Is that making sense? So over here, what should be the multiplication part of mobilization? And I'm going to suggest to you living deployed. Again, the aircraft carrier, every person ought to live in common as a family member in the church, doing whatever they need to, holding babies, greeting people, serving people, and simultaneously, people ought to live deployed. They ought to be everyday missionaries into everyday mission fields where they work, live, and play. This is the church being the church into all the crevices of society, not just an attractional thing for Sunday. But here's the reality. We're so focused on this volunteer. We just want to get 3 hours of their time a week, okay? We're not even thinking about making everyday. This is the everyday missionary part over here. We don't have time to equip them as everyday missionaries because we got to put all their effort in. It takes 927 children's workers every week to do things. All right, in my last 3 minutes, third dimension. Here's how simple the third dimension is, and there's a plus and a multiply. First dimension, disciple making. If we're radically successful at disciple making, the fruit of radically good disciple making is you better be prepared. What are you going to do with the fruit of that in terms of mobilization? Do you have a model that the mobilization is to fill every nook and cranny of society? Or are you going to see the fruit of disciple making as another strategy for fueling the programmatic volunteerism that's required to do it? Is that making sense? But let's say right now, we're really successful at the disciple making part and we're getting a good balance on the living in common, mobilizing everyday missionaries. Third dimension is really simple. I'm going to use the word what we call capacity building. If you want to use the word scaling, this is where the rubber meets the road. It's where you were wanting to go with leadership development. Your brain went right to the third dimension. Okay, so when you said leadership development, that's not a bad answer. It is part of the 3 dimensions. It's just we've got to root the core of what we're trying to scale in disciple making and mobilization of everyday missionaries. You need to be able to say, when you want to say, oh, leadership development, a leadership development pipeline. When somebody says, why a leadership development pipeline? The answer's got to be this simple: to fuel and scale our disciple making ability and our mobilization ability. I'm going to suggest to you that any kind of activities that you want to take, like this is a good filter for you. Any activities you want to go after, if there isn't a why that links back to Jesus' style of disciple making and mobilizing everyday missionaries into everyday mission fields where they work, live, and play, you've got to be really careful, because anything you want to go spend time and energy on that doesn't link to biblical disciple making and scaling biblical disciple making and or biblical mobilization, you may be out on a windy corner with those activities. Leadership development's a good thing, but leadership development for the sake of leadership development, just to grow what we're doing, it better be rooted in the growing the capacity. Does everybody know what the definition of capacity is? From an engineering standpoint, if I tell you, go get the gallon of milk out of the refrigerator, you immediately get a picture in your mind. You almost feel the weight of 1 gallon. Capacity is how much of something can you hold, okay? If you start a house church, your capacity let's say you do it bivocationally. You're working a full-time job. You got a house that the living room can be packed to 20 people. Well, the combination of your bivocational role, the size of your church, you've got a capacity right now to grow that house church to 20 people. You better not wait till you get 20 people who are doing disciple making Jesus way and doing mobilization the New Testament way. You better not wait till you get to 20 people to start thinking, whoa, what happens when we get to 20 people and we hit our capacity? You've always got to be looking ahead saying, what is our capacity? What limits our capacity? Okay. I'm just going to suggest to you the reason that the operating system question is so important. Come back to this messy page. We are so consumed in the way we do things by this side of the equation. Capacity building in the US operating system context is usually in butts, buildings, budgets. It's the programmatic part of capacity. And I'm challenging you to think about what really is addition capacity and what's multiplication capacity. And some of the things that are common to programs are going to be here. Yes, we've got to worry about facilities. Like, what do we do with facilities? Yes, leadership development. Yes, but you've got to bring this back to the scorecard question that if you were radically successful today at disciple making and mobilization, what's it look like over the next 10 years? What does capacity building look like over the next 10 years? One path is to say house church movement. We're not going to worry about facilities. It's a bivocational model, always in houses. Now the capacity building is the network part of it. How do the different house churches connect together and work with one another? All right. I've used my time, Sean. I'm happy to get back on again, but I apologize for using my time. No,
yeah. We appreciate you coming on and at least introducing us to, the ideas here. I know, guys, as you think about what Todd's, saying here, I appreciate, the idea of the balance. Hopefully, we have to understand that, like he said, it's not a, either or, but it's a both and. And, a lot of the stuff that he's been talking about, we've actually kind of, we've got some ideas called multiplication thinking, just some common ideas that, often maybe aren't necessarily, we oftentimes think about when it comes to growing a local church, but we've got a little illustration of different things, like one practical thing that we oftentimes encourage churches to do if you want to be a multiplying church, is obviously tithe to church planting. Like I've heard Todd say, if you want to make the decision to be a reproducing church, make the decision just to tithe to church planting. Set aside money that you can invest in church planting. Another practice would be don't build a building, don't essentially invest in brick and mortar until you have planted a church, planted a campus, multiplied, because, that oftentimes becomes that magnet, that you got to feed the beast. But if you are able to kind of be intentional and get the ball rolling on the multiplication, maybe eventually someday it makes sense for you to add a building and through that addition, it will lead to more multiplication. But just some basic practices that we'll talk a little bit more about later. But at least we got the ball rolling on this conversation and get kind of a different paradigm shift. And hopefully we're seeing the full hand.
I think real quickly, Sean, even the picture in your mind, that's a simple one, is the idea of an apple tree, an apple orchard, and apple orchards, plural. Like the local context that we normally think of is our apple tree. Like, what are we doing with the fruit on our tree? You need to come to grips with your vision. What's an orchard mean for you? For your tree to be part of an orchard, what's that mean? But then we're scaling meaning up and to the right impact. I'm going to suggest to you that thinking about just our tree is down here. Thinking about our orchard is here. If you really want to get to exponential impact, It's thinking not about one tree and not about an orchard. It's thinking about how do we be part of, looking back in 10 years and there's 100 orchards that didn't exist. Not just 100 trees, but 100 orchards. And keep thinking and. This spectrum is an and spectrum between the two. The health of what we do locally, we have got to invest in local capacity. That house church with 25 people doing disciple making, we got to invest in the local capacity of that. But we also have to recognize this is the metaphor that when the airplane's going down and they tell the mother, breathe your own air before giving the mask to the kid. There's truth to what we reproduce, who and what we are. We better be investing in the health of local, because why would we think what we do beyond local is more healthy than what we do locally? So, but the question is simultaneously, you could say church planting is on this end and just our local church is over here. And what Sean is suggesting is something as simple as, and I'm done when I say this, Sean, but people ask me frequently, if we wanted to be a level 4 and 5 church, is there something we should be doing? And I tell people all the time, tithe to church planting. You will be a level 4 or 5 church if you tithe to church planting. If you give your first fruits to church planting, even when you can't afford to, and there's not a church in the United States out of 340,000 right now that can't have an elders meeting tonight and decide they're going to start tithing to church planting. There's not one church that couldn't make that programmatic decision. Think about the obscenity here. It's a programmatic decision to decide to tithe to church planting. That's a programmatic decision. It's a faith decision, but it's still a programmatic decision. It just takes an elder vote or somebody to say, yes, we're going to do it. Now, it might end up being insanely crazy because you don't have the money, but it's still a programmatic decision, right? And I would just suggest that we don't have any problem getting up on a Sunday morning and doing a sermon series to teach our people the principle of first fruits. Are you willing to give the first of yourself to someone else? There's not a church that has a hard time doing that. And yet, churches themselves don't practice the same thing they preach. If we could just get churches themselves practicing the principle of tithing, but tithing to another orchard, not to our own tree. If we could just do that, getting churches practicing the principle of first fruits, we don't even need to be having this conversation. We'd be past the tipping point and see greater than 16% of US churches at level 4 and 5. We'd solve the multiplication problem just by people tithing their first fruits. So I would challenge you not just on money. Are you giving away your best people to church planting? What if, in Sean's language, you committed to release your best staff person to plant a church before keeping your best staff people? What if you plant your first church before you get your first permanent facility? For sure, you better plant your first church before you do your first multi-site. As soon as you go down the dangerous path of, oh, we'll try a multi-site first, guess what percentage of churches that think they'll do multi-site and then they'll do church planting actually end up church planting? They get stuck on multi-site because it's not all it's made out to be, kind of thing. So, all right.